With that, we'll get started. I want to make one quick announcement. We down at Bethany Station are going to set up a special event station. VOA is getting ready to celebrate its 80th broadcast year in February. So we're going to set up a special event station with us, Washington, D.C., the Ham Club at the facility in Washington, D.C., and Greenville, North Carolina, where we still have an operating shortwave station. So I'll get information to Phyllis. We don't have all the details worked out. We know the call signs will be at W8, W3, and W4 VOA, but we've got to get some details worked out on that. So with that, I'll get started. Everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. There's a reason most people don't know about us. It was a secret operation. We probably 80% of the people that come in the museum drive by every day, had no clue what went on back there, and are just absolutely amazed. And then we get a lot of people from around the country also, but it was a secret operation. So it's no surprise that people here around Dayton, Columbus, Cincinnati did not know what we were. We were known as the Siege Guns of Radio, and I'll explain that as the presentation goes on. And the one thing that's probably not well known is by legislation, VOA was restricted from broadcasting to the United States. The commercial interest in broadcast got to Congress early and passed legislation, and the government was not allowed to own a radio station and not allowed to be a broadcaster. So that was one of the reasons that we did not broadcast. If you lived near us, yes, you heard us in your telephone, your stereo, your hot water heater. We couldn't get rid of us. We're a ham radio operator that had a good receiver could pick us up, but that's about the only people that knew what we did. Is VOA still on the air? Yes, absolutely. VOA is bigger today than it ever has been right now. If you add the audience for those 10 stations, those 10 networks together, VOA is 10 times larger than those networks put together. We have a listening audience right now of over 200, not me, I'm not VOA, I'm with the museum. VOA has a listening audience of over 280 million people, and it's growing on a regular basis and has ever since the beginning. During the war, they had maybe 15, 20 million weekly. During the Cold War, it built up to maybe 75 million. And when we went virtual, it just exploded, and I'll explain that later. We are not the largest international broadcaster in the world. The BBC is the largest. They were the largest when they started, and they still are. VOA and BBC are what's called a whitelisted station. To be whitelisted, you have to earn the reputation of telling the truth, and you just can't say, well, we're going to tell you the truth. You have to prove that you actually have done that over a number of months and years. The propaganda was much better defined and organized back then. It was black, white, or gray. VOA was gray. Most of it was black. They lied. They didn't tell you where they were. You didn't know where the transmitter was. Pretty much everything was a big fat lie. There was a little bit of gray. Hitler did put a shortwave station on with rhombics pointed into the United States. It was called the Voice of Free America, and there was a defector out of Iowa that was the announcer. He had a Midwestern accent. He sounded real. He knew the countryside. So you listened to it. It sounded like he could be American. He was American, but he was in Germany pushing the Nazi program. You all know this, but I want to reset the expectation a little bit. In 1920s, 30s, 40s, and actually up into the 50s, the only way you got worldly information was by shortwave radio. We did not have the networks set up then. And so if you were a shortwave listener, you had some idea what was going on. And that's one of the reasons most of the radios sold, from Paul Crosley to all the rest, included not just medium wave, but low wave and HF on it. And that's how you got the information. To put this story together, and so it makes sense, it's important to go through a little bit of history. And I want to very quickly jump through some history here and kind of hang on to your seats, because this is an international story. So I jump from international to local I jump around a lot. So one slide may not go with a slide just before that. But I want to pick up right after World War I and move up where we had a lot of countries involved in World War I. And the war ended in 1918. By 1920, Hitler had to sign, or they had Hitler sign the Treaty of Versailles, which was going to limit the military buildup, his ability to build up the military. That lasted for a while, but by the time the 1920s came along, he was not paying attention to that. The other thing is going on in parallel here. Radio is emerging. 1920 was kind of the break point to when we had crystal sets, and people were listening to them. They were on the market now commercially, so people could listen to some broadcasts. We did not have a lot of transmitting stations on the air at that time. And Paul Crossley down here in Cincinnati started his radio corporation, the Crossley Radio Corporation, and this Harco radio was his first radio. It took off like gangbusters. And when you look at the schematic of it, it was a coil and a diode. There was not even a tuning capacitor in there. You had to buy the headphones separately, but it was very successful. You had to put a long wire out the antenna, but it was a radio, did pick up the stations, and people loved it. And that gave Crossley the kickstart that he needed. Paul Crossley was the idea man. His brother Lewis was the engineer. Lewis was the one that's really made everything work, did the engineering work and hired the engineers. Paul Crossley was the one that came up with all the great ideas. It wasn't long. We had the crystal sets using galena or pyrite. In a couple of years, Armstrong and DeForest are developing the vacuum tube. We're getting vacuum tube on the market very quickly, and consequently, we're getting vacuum tube transmitters. Yet, in 1922, Paul Crossley put a transmitter on the air at 50 watts, which we now know to be WLW. It started out as an experimental station, HCR, and eventually got the license WLW. And that's kind of where this whole story starts, is with WLW and Paul Crossley. Also going on in the rest of the world is shortwave radio. This is not an American event. This is going on worldwide, all over Europe, and going on actually in South America, also Asia, China. So it's spreading. It makes you wonder how it spread, because we did not have the internet, we did not have email. How did they figure all this out? Well, shortwave radio works, and they're listening. And so you pick up tidbits here and there. But Germany was making a very rapid start at shortwave radio. Crossley put on a shortwave station in 1922. He put a shortwave station on. It was called WLW O for overseas, and started small, 250 watts, and then kept bumping it up. And by the time the war began, we were up to 70. He was up to 75,000 or 75 kW. Became a very important part of this overall story. But shortwave started early in the emergence of radio. As I mentioned, it's going on around the world. The other countries are also making good progress in shortwave radio. The thing that never was very well understood is that Germany really, we don't know why, but they grasped the strategic value of radio very, very quickly. Within a couple of years, they got into this, and they knew this was the way of the future for them. They developed military use for it very quickly. That's what they saw the value was communication for the military. And the other thing that was going on here is right here in Cincinnati. There were manufacturers all over the country that were starting to build tube-type radios, but they were very expensive. This is just a typical RCA unit. They all typically were over $100. And what put Paul Crossley on the map was his ability to become known as the Henry Ford of radio. He could make products affordable. And he put this radio, one tube radio, on the market for under $10 when the rest of them were selling for $100, and just absolutely took the market by storm, became the largest radio manufacturer in the country. And we used the comparison. RCA used a Sky Terrier called Nipper, so Paul Crossley used a Sky Terrier called the Pup, and it's a Pup versus Nipper, and the Pup wins big time with the volume. And he just took the market with that small radio. The As we move in through the 20s, we're gonna get away from the black box with a knob on the front. Everybody had a black box with a knob on the front, and that was utilitarian. It worked. And it started to become aesthetic, and we're starting to enter this what we've heard as the golden age of radio, which we no longer treat it as a box in the back room. It's furniture in the front room, and all of the furniture, all the design of it was very aesthetic and pleasing. In fairness to this whole story, we need to recognize that there was something very important going on in 1929. As we're entering in this golden age of radio, we've got the Depression going on. Very important to this country, had a terrific impact on the country. And I don't want to ignore what else is going on in the country. Here is a very important date. You'll see 1940, is that focused where you can see it? Yes, 1942, Europe set up a broadcasting network, which we know today to be BBC. Germany had set up a network in the mid-1930s. BBC is about 5-8 years behind Germany setting up a broadcasting network. They come right out of the chute, large, building lots of transmitters, putting a lot of broadcast power on the air, and became the largest then, and they still are the largest today. That date is going to be important as we move this story forward. By the time 1933 came along, Nazis take power, hooked up with the museum or the VOA again, so it's all just like ham radio getting to play with big transmitters, you know. So with that, we'll get started. I want to make one quick announcement. We down at Bethany Station are going to set up a special event station. VOA is getting ready to celebrate its 80th broadcast year in February. So we're going to set up a special event station with us, Washington, D.C., the Ham Club at the facility in Washington, D.C., and Greenville, North Carolina, where we still have an operating shortwave station. So I'll get information to Phyllis. We don't have all the details worked out. We know the call signs will be at W8, W3, and W4. VOA, but we've got to get some details worked out on that. So with that, I'll get started. Everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. There's a reason most people don't know about us. It was a secret operation. We probably 80% of the people that come in the museum drive by every day, had no clue what went on back there, and are just absolutely amazed. And then we get a lot of people from around the country also, but it was a secret operation. So it's no surprise that people here around Dayton, Columbus, Cincinnati did not know what we were. We were known as the siege guns of radio, and I'll explain that as the presentation goes on. And the one thing that's probably not well known is by legislation, VOA was restricted from broadcasting to the United States. The commercial interest in broadcast got to Congress early and passed legislation, and the government was not allowed to own a radio station and not allowed to be a broadcaster. So that was one of the reasons that we did not broadcast. If you lived near us, yes, you heard us in your telephone, your stereo, your hot water heater. We couldn't get rid of us. We're a ham radio operator that had a good receiver could pick us up, but that's about the only people that knew what we did. Is VOA still on the air? Yes, absolutely. VOA is bigger today than it ever has been right now. If you add the audience for those 10 stations, those 10 networks together, VOA is 10 times larger than those networks put together. We have a listening audience right now of over 200, not me, I'm not VOA, I'm with the museum. VOA has a listening audience of over 280 million people, and it's growing on a regular basis. And has ever since the beginning. During the war, they had maybe 15, 20 million weekly. During the Cold War, it built up to maybe 75 million. And when we went virtual, it just exploded, and I'll explain that later. We are not the largest international broadcaster in the world. BBC is the largest. They were the largest when they started, and they still are. VOA and BBC are what's called a whitelisted station. To be whitelisted, you have to earn the reputation of telling the truth, and you just can't say, well, we're going to tell you the truth. You have to prove that you actually have done that over a number of months and years. The propaganda was much better defined and organized back then. It was black, white, or gray. VOA was gray. Most of it was black. They lied. They didn't tell you where they were. You didn't know where the transmitter was. Pretty much everything was a big fat lie. There was a little bit of gray. Hitler did put a shortwave station on with rhombics pointed into the United States. It was called the Voice of Free America, and there was a defector out of Iowa that was the announcer. He had a Midwestern accent. He sounded real. He knew the countryside. So you listened to it. It sounded like he could be American. He was American, but he was in Germany pushing the Nazi program. You all know this, but I want to reset the expectation a little bit. In 1920s, 30s, 40s, and actually up into the 50s, the only way you got worldly information was by shortwave radio. We did not have the network set up then. And so if you were a shortwave listener, you had some idea what was going on. And that's one of the reasons most of the radios sold, from Paul Crosley to all the rest, included not just medium wave, but low wave and HF on it. And that's how you got the information. To put this story together, and so it makes sense, it's important to go through a little bit of history. And I want to very quickly jump through some history here and kind of hang on to your seats, because this is an international story. So I jump from international to local I jump around a lot. So one slide may not go with a slide just before that. But I want to pick up right after World War I and move up where we had a lot of countries involved in World War I. And the war ended in 1918. By 1920, Hitler had Hitler sign the Treaty of Versailles, which was going to limit the military buildup, his ability to build up the military. That lasted for a while, but by the time the 1920s came along, he was not paying attention to that. The other thing is going on in parallel here. Radio is emerging. 1920 was kind of the break point to when we had crystal sets, and people were listening to them. They were on the market now commercially, so people could listen to some broadcasts. We did not have a lot of transmitting stations on the air at that time. And Paul Crosley down here in Cincinnati started his radio corporation, the Crosley Radio Corporation, and this Harco radio was his first radio. It took off like gangbusters. And when you look at the schematic of it, it was a coil and a diode. There was not even a tuning capacitor in there. You had to buy the headphones separately, but it was very successful. You had to put a long wire out the antenna, but it was a radio. It did pick up the stations, and people loved it. And that gave Crosley the kickstart that he needed. Paul Crosley was the idea man. His brother Louis was the engineer. Louis was the one that's really made everything work, did the engineering work, and hired the engineers. Paul Crosley was the one that came up with all the great ideas. It wasn't long. We had the crystal sets using galena or pyrite. In a couple of years, Armstrong and DeForest are developing the vacuum tube. We're getting vacuum tube on the market very quickly, and consequently, we're getting vacuum tube transmitters. Yet, in 1922, Paul Crosley put a transmitter on the air at 50 watts, which we now know to be WLW. It started out as an experimental station, HCR, and eventually got the license WLW. And that's kind of where this whole story starts, is with WLW and Paul Crosley. Also going on in the rest of the world is shortwave radio. This is not an American event. This is going on worldwide, all over Europe, and going on actually in South America, also Asia, China. So it's spreading. It makes you wonder how it spread, because we did not have the internet, we did not have email. How did they figure all this out? Well, shortwave radio works, and they're listening. And so you pick up tidbits here and there. But Germany was making a very rapid start at shortwave radio. Crosley put on a shortwave station in 1922. He put a shortwave station on. It was called WLW for overseas, and started small, 250 watts, and then kept bumping it up. And by the time the war began, we were up to 70. He was up to 75,000 or 75 kW. Became a very important part of this overall story. But shortwave started early in the emergence of radio. As I mentioned, it's going on around the world. The other countries are also making good progress in shortwave radio. The thing that never was very well understood is that Germany really, we don't know why, but they grasped the strategic value of radio very, very quickly. Within a couple of years, they got into this, and they knew this was the way of the future for them. They developed military use for it very quickly. That's what they saw the value was communication for the military. And the other thing that was going on here is right here in Cincinnati. There were manufacturers all over the country that were starting to build tube-type radios, but they were very expensive. This is just a typical RCA unit. They all typically were over $100. And what put Paul Crosley on the map was his ability to become known as the Henry Ford of radio. He could make products affordable. And he put this radio, one tube radio, on the market for under $10 when the rest of them were selling for $100, and just absolutely took the market by storm, became the largest radio manufacturer in the country. And we used the comparison. RCA used a Sky Terrier called Nipper, so Paul Crosley used a Sky Terrier called the Pup, and it's a Pup versus Nipper, and the Pup wins big time with the volume. And he just took the market with that small radio. As we move in through the 20s, we're gonna get away from the black box with a knob on the front. Everybody had a black box with a knob on the front, and that was utilitarian. It worked. It started to become aesthetic, and we're starting to enter this what we've heard as the golden age of radio, which we no longer treat it as a box in the back room. It's furniture in the front room, and all of the furniture, all the design of it was very aesthetic and pleasing. In fairness to this whole story, we need to recognize that there was something very important going on in 1929. As we're entering in this golden age of radio, we've got the Depression going on. Very important to this country, had a terrific impact on the country. And I don't want to ignore what else is going on in the country. Here is a very important date. You'll see 1940, is that focused where you can see it? Yes, 1942, Europe set up a broadcasting network, which we know today to be BBC. Germany had set up a network in the mid-1930s. BBC is about 5-8 years behind Germany setting up a broadcast network. They come right out of the chute, large, building lots of transmitters, putting a lot of broadcast power on the air, and became the largest then, and they still are the largest today. That date is going to be important as we move this story forward. By the time 1933 came along, Nazis take power in Germany, Hitler's taking power. The first thing he does is he appoints Joseph Goebbels as communication minister, the gentleman on the right-hand side here. And he was just drop-dead brilliant. His PhD was in language, and he understood the strategic value of radio. Hitler's tearing up the Treaty of Versailles, building up his military, and Joseph Goebbels completely understood better than anyone else in the world that if you're going to win a guns and bullet war, you're going to have to win the hearts and minds of the people. You got to get the people behind you. So he went after that, and that's what was behind all this propaganda coming out of Germany. He had a problem. How do you communicate with your people when they don't have a radio and they can't afford it? Radio's over $100. So he subsidized the building of a radio, and normally radios, as I said, were selling for $100. This was $15 you could buy. And it's a 3-tube radio. There's a rectifier, a detector, and a audio amplifier. There is no RF amplifier in that radio. So it was not very sensitive. Consequently, he put broadcasting stations all over Germany. And it worked. It was very effective. Down in the corner of this radio, right here, you see that orange tag? That orange tag is in German, but that's the American translation. It essentially says if you get caught listening to shortwave radio, you're going to prison. And eventually they start executing people if you got caught. I've talked to people in the museum whose parents got caught listening to shortwave and did spend a year in prison in Ukraine and other places. And that particular rule spread worldwide. You could go to South America and everybody knew about this rule of going to prison if you got caught listening. Just 2 years ago, out on the fishing ships of North Korea, the captains had been listening to shortwave for a long time out there. And one of the crew members turned them in, and so North Korea made an example of them. They called about 100 ship captains together and executed the guy that got caught listening in front of them. And this was just 2 years ago in North Korea. So that is still active in certain parts of the world where there's a lot of repression. But just to kind of put everything in together, if you're going to communicate, if you're going to know what's going on in the world, it's going to be by shortwave radio, and all the countries were doing it at that point in time. There was an issue popped up that Hitler did not know how to solve. He makes the radio, he owns the radio station, he's going to have control of the bulk of his population. But we've got these people up here, right here. They're going to be a big problem. They're experimenters. They're called experimenters. They buy radio parts, they put them on boards, and they make receivers. And they start listening. No problem doing that. But then they learn to build transmitters. And they learn to talk to each other. Next town over, and a little further in Germany, and then to Spain and Poland and Austria. And oh my, they're talking out of the country. And Hitler can't control that. So he decides to take control, and he confiscates these people's equipment. Nowadays, we call these people ham radio operators. Back then, they were called experimenters. So essentially, he went through, and if you had a high power, 100 watts transmitter, confiscated it. And he also confiscated or inducted most of the hams into his military. It's not all bad. They had elevated status. If you were a high-speed CW operator, you got special conditions. That microphone right there is a homemade ham radio microphone by a German ham. And when he did his big address in 1933, he's using that amateur radio homemade microphone. So the hams got inducted into his military as radio operators. They knew how to operate it, they knew how to put it on the air, repair it, keep it going. And so amateur radio played a very big part in Hitler's buildup of his military and the success he had in being able to communicate and know what's going on. As I mentioned, if you're a high-speed CW operator, you got very much elevated status, you got better food, better housing, and just regular hams that knew how to put the equipment together and operate it were elevated status, even though they were in the military. This country had not endorsed the strategic value of radio. The only radio that was going on was Roosevelt was using AM broadcast, commercial AM broadcast, to deal with the Depression. It was a big deal in this country, big problem for the president. And so he starts doing fireside chats, which everybody's heard about. But it was over commercial radio stations, and it was doing absolutely zero shortwave broadcast at that time. What was going on in parallel to that, and I apologize for jumping around, in 1934, Paul Crosley had kept building up the power of his transmitters. He was an entrepreneurial of entrepreneurials, if you will. He wanted to sell radios. And the way you sell low-cost radios that weren't necessarily very sensitive is you build big transmitters. And so he built big, powerful transmitters. By 1934, he put a half a megawatt, 500,000 watt station on the air down there that remained on the air for 12 years and had solved engineering-wise all the issues that it took to build a 500 kW transmitter. Became very successful at that. The antenna that's down there, you may have seen it at some point in time, the diamond-shaped antenna was put up as a 5/8 wavelength antenna. It was put up 5/8 wavelength for the very same reason we use 5/8 on UHF or VHF. It squishes the lobe down and we get a lot further distance out. What we don't have to deal with in amateur radio are these two lobes. They just go off in Never Land, and VHF, UHF, we don't have to worry about them. It turns out if you're on 700 kilohertz, it turns out to be an interesting problem. WLW down here in Westchester, Cincinnati, could not be clearly understood in Columbus, Indianapolis, Louisville, and Lexington. This garbled. Why is it garbled? Well, we're pushing two signals in the Columbus. We're pushing that signal, and we're pushing that signal. They came in just a little bit out of phase, and it garbled the audio. So they had to go back, and they took off part of the top of the antenna up there and took it down to a half wave, got rid of those lobes, and then the audio became crystal clear. It wasn't a problem at far distances, you know, the other parts of the United States, but it was close in. So interesting little issue that showed up there from a 5/8 wavelength. The buildup of the military included a lot of experimenting and a lot of development on Hitler's part. The hands were under his control, and they were good. They're smart people, and so he was making good advance. By 1935, considerable advance. In fact, in just 3 years, he had put enough radios out there to have control of most of his people. 56 out of 70 million people had that radio. So he was making considerable progress in implementing his dictatorship. He also, at that point in time, put on a barrage of shortwave stations pointed at the United States, more into Latin America and South America, because he was trying to get South America to go to war with the United States and drag us into it. Roosevelt did not want to get involved in that war. Did not endorse the strategic value of radio. So by 1939, at the beginning of World War II, clearly the best way to communicate is shortwave radio. The top band on radio, if you purchase a radio, the top band is shortwave. This is 5 to 20 megahertz up here of some sort. The AM broadcast is down in the center. So the preferred method is shortwave radio. And by 1933, by 1939, when World War II started, he had 15 million of those radios out in the population of Germany. So it was effective. Also, very important, by 1939, he had learned how to build 200 kilowatt transmitters. Never been done before. Germany figured out how to do it. And his shortwave stations were pushing out 200 kilowatts of RF energy. Probably not a big surprise, because back in 1960, they had 800 kilowatt spark gap transmitters on the air. So they were understanding RF, they were understanding antenna theory, and were very successful at doing that. The invasion of Poland, of course, starts World War II, and now all the shortwave listeners are hearing this. And so the first thing that happens at the beginning of World War II, 1939, is all the listeners kick in big time. All the shortwave, if you're a shortwave listener, you're also a shortwave broadcaster, and CBS, NBC, GE, Westinghouse, Crosley Broadcasting, all had listening stations. CBS set up an unusually large listening station, and Princeton set up what was called the Princeton Listening Lab. It was a lot of very smart people that set up a lot of good equipment that put in a wonderful listening lab. The big elephant in the room, of course, is BBC. That is BBC's listening station. That entire building is filled with receivers and people sitting in front of receivers, tuning around to see what they can find about going on in the war. And remember, this is shortwave. It's not encrypted. So if you want to find out what the battle people are talking about, you just find them on the radio, right? And then that intelligence is fed back to their government. And eventually, BBC shared it with President Roosevelt. So Roosevelt was getting information also and starting to understand that radio might be a little bit more important strategically than he had originally understood. As I mentioned, the United States could not own a radio station and was doing no official broadcast at the start of World War II. So what did they do? They at the beginning of World War II, he said, well, you know, let's dabble. That's my interpretation. Let's dabble in this. He didn't really have any shortwave stations in the country that were very big. There were two of them. GE had a shortwave station in San Francisco, KGEI, that was 50 kilowatts. They were a good station. And WLWO down here in Cincinnati was up at 75 kilowatts and was doing a good job. So they put together the suggested content. They put together an organization called Office of Coordinated Information, provided governmental information to WLWO and KGEI. And so they were officially broadcasting on behalf of the United States government. And secret then, and all the way through VOA, was this antenna. They used a rhombic antenna. It's a diamond-shaped antenna. It's a non-resonant antenna, and in order for it to function, it has to have be one wavelength on a side. And so WLW early on started using rhombic antennas because they're very directional and they have high gain. One of the restrictions of that antenna is that you have to waste half the energy off the end of it. You put the feed point line in here, and you have to put a resistor out there and take out half the energy. So if you're putting in 50 kilowatts, you've got to dissipate 25 kilowatts at the other end in a resistor. And that's the way the rhombic worked. And it worked, and people accepted that. The way the rhombic works is, as long as you get a wavelength out here, you've got 4 lobes pointing forward. It's going to narrow that beam down. You've got 2 lobes heading in. They cancel. And these 2 side lobes go out to the side, and they can be useful in certain situations. It gives you a very narrow pattern, a very high gain. Typical gain is 14, 15, 16 dBi gain on forward gain for a rhombic. WLW engineers, love them, we're really bothered over having to waste that much power. Psychologically, there's something not right about that story. I'm making all this power and I've got to waste it in a resistor. Well, they did something absolutely brilliant. They took, here's one of their first rhombics. The feed point is down here. This is the rhombic here. And you'll see the dropping resistor here. It's a big transmission line that's a dropping resistor where they're dissipating that power. They decided to take that, the feed line is here, this is to scale, that's a person there, and this is where the dropping resistor was. What they decided to do is just brilliant. They said, well, you know what? Instead of dropping that, let's push it back to the input and put it in phase, and we'll put it back in the input. So they put a transmission line down here, a couple stubs to do some stub matching, and fed it back to the input, and got a 98% efficiency out of that antenna. Normal efficiency was about 50%. Now, in your and my world, that's 3 dB. And it may seem like 3 dB may not be worth the effort, but when you start thinking about the power that you're dissipating and wasting, it starts to become important. And if you get bigger power, it even means a lot more. So that became known as the reentrant rhombic antenna. It was very secret. They did not share it with anyone. And when VOA kicked in, VOA did not share it with any other VOA location worldwide. Bethany was the only place that had it. They had, around WLW, they had fences and a guard tower and searchlights and all kinds of stuff to protect it. That was the big secret going on at WLW. So when it came down to VOA, it was still extra secret. And that's why they secured the place, and why you had trouble learning about what was going on inside the boundaries. If you run the numbers, just 75 kilowatts of input power, the ERP, 2.3 megawatts of output power being pushed off the end of that antenna. When we moved up to our big transmitters, 250 kilowatts, we're pushing out 25 megawatts of RF energy off the end of that thing. This is serious. This is some serious power, and it's going to impact your surroundings also, and I'll explain that. What it would do, the antenna's pointed that way. This was all rural, very rural country. Tractors would stop in the middle of a field. Cars would stop in the middle of the road. The impact on the electronics in a vehicle was outstanding in terms of doing damage. So it became a pretty big issue. In fact, eventually, when we put the big transmitters on the air, Detroit sent cars down here to drive around and see if their car would survive. Bethany, like a lot of stations, we took up a square mile, and they would never tell anyone ahead of time what the broadcast schedule was. So we had 27 rhombics. You never knew which rhombic was active at any point in time. So they hired a driver to sit there and drive that square mile all day long like that, waiting for their car to die, because they figure they're going to run under one of these antennas sometime during the day. And so there was a lot of traffic around the station just doing EMP testing for their vehicle. Mercedes-Benz sent some cars over, and they drove that circuit. But you get some unusual issues when you're dealing with high power. Along comes 1940, France falls, and Roosevelt's figuring out that he's going to get drug in this war one way or the other. So he starts building Liberty ships at a fantastic rate. And the other issue he had was we had a spy network, but we did not have a high-speed communication network with the spy network. We had, of course, spies in Europe, Africa, South America. And what he did is he came into Cincinnati, and this was in all the literature you'll read, the government never owned a radio station. Not true. The government took control of WLWO, owned it, and operated it as a connection to the spy network around the world. And they put together the secret message in Washington, and the only way you had that to get here was make a record. So they would make a record, a secret agent would get on an airplane, back in those days was the old DC-8, fly all the way to Cincinnati, come out to the station, and they had another secret agent stationed at WLWO that nobody knew was a secret agent. He gave it to him, and he stood there and said, I want this to play at 2:15 Tuesday afternoon on this frequency, on that antenna pointed that way. And he stood there until it was played. And then he'd play it on some other frequencies, and they would spend a half a day playing that message. And when it was all played, he'd break up the record, throw it away, and then go back home and come back the next week with another secret message. The message they were sending used what you may have understood or may already know about. It's called a Onetime Pad. It's a numbers encryption where you encrypt your message with either random letters or random numbers. And there were pads put together, made up on a random basis with just a string of numbers. And the messages were coded and transmitted, stating those strings of numbers and letters. The code was unbreakable then, and it's still unbreakable today. It's the only code that is unbreakable. And the not so good news, I'm not sure I want to say this, is that the drug industry, the drug cartel knows that, and that's one of the ways they coordinate very successfully their shipments, is they can code it, and you'll never figure out what it is. Guess what the favorite way of transmitting that one-time pad code is? You can push it over the internet, and somebody can read it, no big deal. The favorite way of doing it is still shortwave radio, because shortwave does not leave a trail. Computers leave a trail. One way or the other, they're going to leave a trail. So still today, you can tune around and you can find what's called number stations. You may have listened to them in shortwave. The number stations, it's just a lady, typically a lady because her voice comes through a little bit more clear, just reading numbers. It makes no sense at all. What are they doing? They're reading one-time pad numbers. So that's how the messages were transmitted. Big wake-up call comes Pearl Harbor and the entire world is going to change at this point. The government at that point in time completely bought into the strategic value of radio. And within 7 days of Pearl Harbor, they kicked in the GE station in San Francisco. They wanted to turn on WLWO, but we had to do some work. And that went on the air 7 days after Pearl Harbor, officially broadcasting U.S. Information. It took a couple of months. They had to reconfigure WLWO and the antennas, and eventually they put that on the air as the primary station. Because of the re-entrant Rombrick, they could push a heck of a signal into Germany. And consequently, that became the very first broadcast for Voice of America. Here's where the philosophy of the agency kicked in. They made very early a decision to, what is our strategy for doing this? Well, very early, they said, we're going to tell the truth, and the news may be good, the news may be bad, but we're going to tell the truth. In the first 2 years of the war, the United States is losing the war, and they're losing it big time. They are broadcasting that the United States had so many troops killed, so many tanks destroyed, so many aircraft destroyed, ships destroyed, etc. And the news was not very good. It wasn't very inspiring to listen to the Voice of America if you're an American, but we weren't broadcasting to the United States. When the war changed and America started winning, they broadcast that, and all of that was very, very believable because it was, in fact, the truth. The badge of honor that Cincinnati carries to this day is early on, right away, Hitler started listening because we're putting one commanding signal into Germany. And in all of his broadcasts, he would say, don't listen to those Cincinnati liars. So that became proof of success, if you will. A few years ago, we celebrated our 75th anniversary, and we had a beer made called Cincinnati Liars Lager, and it went pretty well. Okay, so at the beginning of World War II, at Pearl Harbor, this is what the shortwave world looked like on a global basis. Japan's got 42 transmitters. I'll talk about Russia separately. Germany's got 68 shortwave transmitters on the air, and they know how to do 200 kilowatts. The United States, on the books, we had 14, if you count all of the broadcasters, but there were only 2 of them that mattered, and when it really got down to it, there was really only one, and that was WLWO here in Cincinnati, and that's because of the re-entrant Rombrick. They could push out over 2 megawatts of RF off the end of the thing. So that's what the shortwave situation looked like. Roosevelt completely buys in at this point and calls all the broadcasters back, the manufacturers, to a big meeting and says, I need high-power shortwave transmitters. Had a meeting, made that request, and it was quiet as a church mouse in that meeting. Nobody said anything, nobody raised their hand. He was getting very frustrated. Time to take a coffee break, folks. Let's take a break here. Comes back. President of Crosley Broadcasting raised his hand and said, Mr. President, we can do that. And because they had already done 500,000 watt AM station, they didn't know how to do shortwave. It was still a mystery, but they thought, well, we've got most of the problems solved. Maybe we can figure out how to make tubes work at 20 megahertz. So they went home with a one-page contract. They said, build 6 high-powered, 200 kilowatt transmitters, 22 high-efficiency antennas, no cost, just go home, get it done as best you can, as quick as you can. So they went home and took a couple of years, time to design the building and get it built. And by 1942, or by 1944, February 1st, 1944, they went on the air. The transmitters were done. The transmitters were built in the building down there where the station is now. Transmitter was done and tested before the roof of the building went on. They were just, each one's moving along as fast as they can. But it started testing and they were on the air July 1st, 1944 as an official Voice of America station. They were all private licenses. These are all WLW stroke call signs of one sort or another. And the President Roosevelt and the president and the chairman of the FCC referred to Cincinnati then as the siege guns of radio. That's when they really bought into the strategic value of radio and said this is going to have to be an important part of winning this war, because they still weren't winning the war then. You know, the U.S. is still losing the war. So they did a better job. They set up the Office of War Information. The first one was very disheveled, very disorganized. Office of War Information, better people in there, better reporters, better information, and they really started putting out some organized information on behalf of the U.S. government. And the broadcast started in New York. This is one of the stations, just literally some perforated tile on the wall, a table, and a microphone pumped in, and then that audio is piped over. Back then, it was piped over AT&T AT&T lease lines into Cincinnati. We put it on a transmitter and broadcast it. But the recording studios, the broadcast studios, looked. That is one of them. Looked just like that. So this took some time. This did not happen right away. So when the United States got built out, they put in four transmitting plants in the United States. There's us here in Cincinnati. There's two out in California, Dixon and Delano, California. And then about the time Vietnam kicked in, they built a big facility down in Greenville, North Carolina. So we had 4 stations in the United States, over 51 high-power transmitters. The rest of these red dots, I don't know how well they show up around here, are relay stations. They were as big or bigger than we were, picking up the signal and rebroadcasting because of propagation issues. So when they got built out, we had over 130 high-power transmitters that could be put on the air at any point in time. A little interesting part here is a lot of difficulty getting deep into Russia. And the best way is to park right next to them. So they put a ship, used a Coast Guard ship called a courier, because it's non-confrontational. Coast Guard cutters are allowed anywhere pretty much in the world because they don't have guns. And so they put a large broadcasting station on this ship, and the transmitter was 150 kW pushing out message in from Cincinnati. We would broadcast to this ship, and then they would push out from there. The antenna was a balloon originally, and it lasted for a while, but every time a storm came along, it kept breaking the cable. So they eventually went to inverted deltas on the ship rather than trying to use a balloon that was up from the station. The receive station was at the other end of the ship. If you're going to have a 150 kW transmitter on one end, you're not going to have very much of a receiver at the other end. It's going to overload the front end. So they built this kind of a half-hearted attempt to build a Faraday cage, and it didn't work. So they eventually put the receive station up on the island of Rhodes and put a VHF link out to the ship. So just a side note, the ship used a lot of fuel. There was 1.5 million watts of generation power in the hull of the ship in order to put a gas hose in the ship, and the entire American fleet showed up. The carrier, all of its destroyers, air support, everybody shows up. And it's a big spectacle. I mean, the whole island of Rhodes would come out and watch that ship get filled up with gas. Okay, so now we've got high power transmitters. How do you get an audience? You all know how to get an audience. Well, Hitler did too. He had the big hammer. He built the radio stations, he built the transmitters. It's the only thing you can pick up. So he's got an audience. But how does the United States get an audience? Just because you've got a high power transmitter, why are people going to listen to you? The United States had a fantastic secret weapon. It was the music of jazz. Nowhere else in the world could produce jazz the way the United States could. Other countries tried to emulate it, could never get it right, and it was revered around the world. In fact, several countries outlawed jazz. If you get caught playing jazz, you're going to prison. So first thing VOA did was get a hold of Louis Conover. They put the Louis Conover Jazz Hour on. Fats Domino and Louis Armstrong were big performers at VOA, and they would play jazz, and then they'd interject news and bulletins, and that's how you build an audience. That's how you got the information out. And it worked very well. The sources at that time during the war, you had to have 3 sources of information, verifiable sources, before any story went on the air, and remained that way all the way until after World War II, and then they relaxed down to you just needed 2 sources. But during the war, you had to have 3 verifiable sources. And I'll just take a quick time out to mention something, because I really don't get into this whole business of propaganda, misinformation, etc. in this talk. But as everyone knows in the room, it's a big subject these days. Who can you trust? What can you trust? Misinformation, fake news, etc. And I want to mention that the state of Illinois just passed legislation requiring a class in every public high school on media literacy. And they specifically spell out 6 points that must be covered in that class. And it's essentially, how do you tell the truth? What steps do you have to go through to determine if you're listening to the truth, multiple sources, etc., etc. So first one in Illinois just a few months ago, and it's kind of expected to move state to state. I don't know that, but that's one of the expectations. I just want to mention that because it's as important today as it was back in World War II and during the Cold War. The other issue is a lot of our words don't translate. There's over 40,000 words in the American dictionary. They don't all translate very well. Russia doesn't have the word the or science, etc., etc. So to solve that, VOA put together a special dictionary. They took the dictionary and skinned it down to just 1,500 words called Special English. And all the broadcast bulletins and announcements had to use Special English. All the broadcasts today are using Special English. It's still effective. And because right now, today, they're translating in over 60 different languages and dialects. And there's a lot of words that just don't translate. So they're still effective today. There's books published. You can get them on Amazon in all the different languages on that translation from English into their language. As we leave World War II, get up through the Cold War, VOA is way more important because it becomes strategic. The government has figured out that strategic value of radio is very important. So it played a very big part during the war, or during the Cold War. The other thing they did to gain an audience, interesting, we all take it for granted, but health information, health and sanitary information worldwide is not very well understood even today in Africa, but all during the Cold War, there were a lot of countries that did not know how to properly take care of a wound. And so health programs were revered. People would wait to VOA broadcast a health program. So it was a good way of getting the information out. The towers came down. The station was decommissioned in 1994, as was the 2 stations in California. Went virtual and became satellite, cellular, internet. And everything that VOA does today is on the internet. All the broadcasts are on the internet. And they buy time on stations around the world. We're on over 3,000 FM stations. VOA pays us bills, so stations like them to come in and buy time. If you need 4 hours, VOA can get it. The Africa situation is amazing. They don't have an infrastructure, but they have cell phones and they have laptops connected to the internet. This is their cell phone tower set up in Africa. Standalone, self-supporting, and works as long as an elephant doesn't bump into it. The other thing that was going on when those towers came down is, and you all have lived through this, you lived through the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and very turbulent times, and a lot of aggression going on then. Well, one of the things that started creeping into the VOA broadcast was bias. It was a code of honor not to be biased, but it was creeping in. Congress found out, had a hissy fit, and passed what was called the VOA firewall. And in 1994, the firewall said that no one can change the reporter's story, not the reporter's boss, not the director of the VOA, not the President of the United States. And that has stood the test of time and still is in play today, that what the reporter reports goes on the air. It may get translated in different languages and the words flipped around, but it's still the same story. Presidents have tried to make the VOA their station. Recent presidents, and quite a few over the years, have thought VOA ought to be the president's station. No, it's not. It's the United States station, and they're going to not do propaganda. Today, all over YouTube, lots of videos going on, big up broadcast operation for videos. The interesting thing going on in this business, when you spend this kind of money to put this size of a transmitter on the air, you're going to be held accountable. This is work ethic of those days was if you say you're going to do it, you better doggone well be doing it. So what they did was there was a listening post at every embassy, every consulate had a listening post. Then they hired over 64 special technical listeners around the world. And all they did was listen to your broadcast, would grade it for clarity, fading, jamming. Yeah, I'm going to talk about that. But we would get, keep saying VOA would get graded on their signal. And the embassies would send in a report monthly. Eventually, satellites kicked in and they set up remote listening. So right here in Bethany, we could tune up. They could pull in any little receiver around the world and say, well, how's our signal in Sri Lanka or Liberia or Brazil? And you could hear it. And if it's not what it should be, then you better be making corrections. Let's talk about jamming a little bit here. I'm running along a little bit. Antenna to antenna. We all know shortwave's antenna to antenna, unless you have a jammer. Well, jammers were really big business back then. You either took an offensive position or a defensive position. You took offensive, you put in big high-power propaganda stations. If you didn't want to do that, you put in jamming stations. And every country had it. I will just explain a few here. This is Lithuania. And they would have two stations. They would have a listening station manned, and she just sits there all day and listens for incoming signals. If she can hear it, it's coming into Lithuania. This lady is at a different location. They're about 15 miles apart. And by the way, most of these were run by women because men are busy at war. And they had the Leningrad Institute of Technology, and women became very good, very well schooled, and they loved to get into jamming. This fit them like a glove. So she would pick up something that's coming in, and she'd tune up. They've got about 8 or 10 high-powered transmitters here, and she would tune up one of them, and all they would do is send out a buzzer. That's all you're transmitting, the buzzer. There's some jamming signal, but it was very aggressive and very active. That's what Lithuania did. China is still doing it today. They went very aggressive. They put up these rotatable curtain antennas. There are a curtain antenna's got 8 dipoles. There's 4 dipoles down here and 4 dipoles there in front of a reflector screen. And they pick up another 3 dB off of Mozambique. We went to, Bethany went to curtain antennas eventually. But China put in 13 of these rotatable curtain antennas, each with a 0.5 megawatt transmitter behind it. Huge. But what they can do, it's up in the Western Province, and they can push very successfully a jamming signal pretty much all over China. Let's talk about Russia, because they did a very unusual situation in Russia. That's the Leningrad Communication Institute. Russia took the position of defense. And what they did was they put jamming transmitters in each of the receiving city, each of the major cities around Germany, around Russia, I should say. And what they actually did is you could pick any one of those dots, and what it is, they would put a jamming transmitter for every single signal coming into that city. And they didn't have to be high power. A 5 kilowatt, 10 kilowatt transmitter would do the job. You didn't need high power. So they would, those are a lot easier to build, a lot easier to construct and maintain, but they would have that around the city. But maybe they understood it, maybe they didn't. But what was good about that is that when you've got a high-power shortwave transmitter in Moscow, 100 miles away, are you going to push a shortwave signal? Not necessarily. There was a lot of open area in shortwave. because they're pushing into their local cities. So when you talk to Russian immigrants, that goes, oh yeah, I could listen to VOA. Well, where'd you live? Well, they're way out in the countryside someplace. But if you're in a city, not a very good chance you're going to pick it up. So Russia took a very aggressive stance at that. Once VOA was allowed to be in Germany, our ally, VOA took an extremely aggressive position at that point. They started building megawatt transmitters. These are they did low frequency, medium wave, and high frequencies. This is the low wave, 173 kilohertz station in Munich, and they put 3 of these in. They're different frequencies, of course, but they started doing million-watt transmitters, and that's what it looked like over here. That one building alone is just a 1 megawatt transmitter. This is just for communications. That's the tower that was originally built out of wood. That tower there is metal, but it was part of the operation. It was kind of like a top-loaded vertical. That's the antenna tuner for the megawatt station. And kind of embarrassing when you have to put your antenna insulator in with a crane and a ladder. I mean, the antenna insulators are kind of big. That's the control center. It was a large operation. There were, I haven't counted, but there were a huge number of high-power transmitters. Not all of them megawatts. They had half megawatts, and their smallest ones were quarter-megawatt transmitters. But a big operation in Munich. Because we're right next door, we can push into Russia. Did put one in Okinawa, or Okinawa did put one in Sri Lanka. So they spread a few of these megawatt transmitters around. Nowadays, still jamming. Jamming is still a big deal. It's satellite jamming, and the technology to do satellite jamming is more sophisticated, but you can figure out how to do it. There's the Baghdad embassy, and you can see all the satellite dishes on top of the embassy. That's why satellite jamming is still big business. That's our control room. I'll explain that if you want to come down for a tour. The other thing that VOA did at the end of the broadcast day, during the broadcast day, they could push out, in an 8-hour period, they could push out 40 hours of programming. And when that was done, they would take another couple hours at the end of the day and push out secret messages. Well, guess what? It's that Onetime Pad information being pushed out. They're doing radio fax. They're pushing out troop maps and everything using the facsimile, but it's radio fax kind of information. Greenville is still on the air. They are pushing out 6 shortwave signals, 3 into Cuba, 3 into Africa. And if you ever want a tour down there, Maycom Daily is, the place is locked up tighter than a drum, but I can give you his information. He'll come out the gate, and he loves to give tours to ham. So if you ever go to Greenville, it's a good place to see an operating station. I put this map up because we all know what this is. What Hitler did not, that E and F layer is up here. What Hitler did not understand was the D layer. D layer goes away at night, and with high power transmitters, we can push an AM signal into Germany. Paul Crosley figured that out with his 500,000 watt AM broadcast station. So what Hitler never counted on was us talking to his radio stations, but it did, because that layer goes away at night. The other issue we have with propagation is it's all about the angle. It's all about the bounce, okay? So when VOA has to cover a wide geographic area, Africa is very wide and very tall. You're not going to do it with one antenna. You're going to hit East Africa, West Africa, East Africa, North or South or Central. And so there were antennas pointed directly at those target locations. The other issue, and the bigger issue almost, is how you're going to get there. You've all seen the gray line displays, and what you really want to do is you want to be broadcasting in the same daylight situation. You want to be all night or all day. So you can do an all nighttime broadcast, or you can do an all daytime broadcast. You'd like not to split day and night if you didn't have to, because of the way the ionosphere changes. And the same with whoever's pushing the signal out around the world. Liberian station, we would push a lot to Liberia, and then they would push into South Africa. kind of thing. So getting a path to Liberia was a lot easier than trying to get a path into South America. The propagation, how to do it was a really big challenge because we've got all these different stations. Us, Dixon and Delano, California, say Liberia and Greenville, with lots of antennas, and we can put a lot of transmitters on in parallel. So figuring out what frequency to be on, what antenna to be on, and what time of day to be on was a really big job, and it was done manually. And a lot of people involved to figure all that out. Eventually, VOA wrote software to put this together because everyone was using a rhombic of one sort, a rhombic or a curtain antenna at one sort or another. And so VOA wrote the vocab program that hams use today. It's open source, public information, and now you can get very colorful maps on propagation. It made the job a whole lot easier. So the station used a lot of power, about 4 megawatts, took power from Dayton and Cincinnati, had a tendency to brown out Mason from time to time on high power, tried to be good neighbors, and so if that got to happening, they'd pull power from Dayton, DP&L, and try to be good neighbors. We took up a square mile, as I mentioned. That is the square mile there. Those white lines are roads out to the antennas. There were 27 rhombic antennas on the property, and of course, eventually in the mid-60s, we put up towers and started putting up curtain antennas and was able to get rid of some of the rhombics. The interesting thing here is that this map has Cincinnati in the center of the world, and there's a very good reason for that. They needed to position these rhombics within a half a degree of accuracy, and the existing maps would not allow that. So Clyde Hanley, one of our engineers, spent 2 weeks with a slide rule, redrawing the map of the world, and put Cincinnati in the center. Now he could accurately position a rhombic within a half a degree. And so people love to be at the station because they're at the center of the world, right? Our targets, these are our targets. We had 10 target locations to point at. Those were the targets, and that's how we did it. There were feed lines going from the big antenna switch. The transmitting building is right there, and when the curtains went up, a lot of the rhombics went down. So that's what the station looked like just before we went off the air. The transmitting plant is in the back of that building. That's the antenna switch right there, and the curtain antenna in the background. Some of the issues with high power transmission is when you've got almost 100 megawatts of ERP floating around, everything's hot. So the building was incredibly well grounded. There's radials, 50-foot radials around the building for grounding. When the building was built, the rebar was tack welded. That's connected to the ground system. And there's copper bar laid in the floor. All the equipment, everything is bolted down to that copper bar. And all the window frames are grounded. There's a wire mesh inside the glass to keep and grounded to keep the charge from building up on the glass. And when we went to the modernized transmitters, they put in a raised floor. You couldn't pick up at the panel without it getting hot. So each individual panel is grounded to the ground system just to keep it safe. Signals left on 300 ohm balanced line coming out of the station, and that is a transmission line. They left the station at 300 ohms balanced. That one's qualified for half a megawatt. These are quarter megawatt stations. Either 1-inch copper pipe. In this situation, it's 1-inch copper pipe, and that's I think double aught wire put together for transmission. It went out. We had to switch 6 transmitters to 22 different antennas, so it's just a crossbar switch. 6 transmitters going in, 22 coming out the side, and looked like this. This is still there, so when you come down, we can walk out and see it. There's 6 transmitters coming in the end of this thing, and 22 coming out the side of it. They're essentially double pole, double throw switches at each of the cross points that are either taking a transmitter on or off that line and an antenna on or off that line. So it was a very manual operation. You had to pull these poles up and down to to make the switches, but it was very manual, went on 24 hours a day. The matching, the curtain antennas was nominally 72, but ran about 62 ohms. They ran 300 ohms out to the curtains and matched it out there. And I show this is a matching transformer. There's a vacuum variable right here, and then there's a pole down here connected to it, and you literally are out there in the field in the ice and the snow cranking this back variable up and down, trying to get the VSWR down. The rhombics, they matched right at the antenna switch. The rhombics came in about 560 ohms, and that was matched and ran out on the transmission lines. So, a little side point here, how do you measure VSWR? Because they did not have directional couplers back then. They literally had to walk the line. They had an RF voltmeter that they would put up on the transmission line and walk up and down and look for the voltage come up. I've got it set up in the station here. That is the voltmeter right there, and it literally runs back and forth on the line. It looked like this. But they literally would have to go out there and walk up and down the transmission line to measure VSWR because they did not have directional couplers. The rhombics were held up with the wood poles. They didn't have metal towers back then. And these are 80-foot utility poles spliced together with a cylinder right there. And right there's the splicing cylinder in order to get a 150-foot tower. And they're slipping the sleeve on in that picture right there. And then it was picked up with a crane and set up and guide, very heavily guide, of course. But wood poles were preferred. Eventually they had to switch to metal towers, which can impact the antenna pattern. But wood towers were, this actually is the, stayed up, that was the reflector for the curtain antenna. They put on wood poles. The other thing going on is 24 hours operation is ice would form on the antennas and guide wires. This is a picture in the wintertime of the switch icing up out here. And so you've got to break that ice loose just to switch antennas, and you get some pretty big pieces falling off. So what they did to try to mitigate that was grease the cables. They had a cherry picker with these guys around, and there's a motor down here that will pull or lower that little container. No hard hats, no safety belts. But he's greasing the cables. And so they go through and grease all the cables and all the antenna wires to keep water from forming on it. And it reduced the impact of the ice. So, sorry I went a little bit long, but that's kind of the end. Questions, comments?
Are there any of the antennas still there?
Not in Bethany or California. Greenville still has quite a few of their antennas. They kept rhombics, and they have a couple of curtains up. So it's a pretty good display down in Greenville, yeah.
I realize that they don't tour the WLW station anymore, but is there ever a possibility that anybody can do that?
That's a very good question. WLW has been sold. WLW is now owned by Hite Radio, and the tower and property was owned by a company called Vertical Bridge. Vertical Bridge has sold that property to a developer, and it's currently undergoing commercial development. The antenna is still there, and it's still active and will remain active. All the land is being developed commercially. I don't think we can get a tour. Jay Adrick, one of the engineers that was involved, did a tour at the last hamvention that we had, which was almost 2 years ago now. He put together a tour of the 500 kW. They still have the 500 WLW 500 kW transmitter in the building. He put together a tour of that. He's talking about doing it at the next hamvention, but whether we get access or not to the building is the issue. So I can't really answer that. It's in process, but it's still there. It's worth a tour. If we could get in, it'd be worth a tour.
How could we get hooked up with that if they decide to do it?
It'll be on Facebook. It'll be on our webpage. It'll be advertised through the hamvention people. as a tour. And I know you, so I can send you an email.
Did they have a system where they could control the vertical angle of radiation off of their antennas?
Good question. Not off the rhombics. The rhombics were calculated ahead of time to have a certain takeoff angle. The curtain antennas, in the 50s, when the curtains went up, they were not steerable. But later on, you could steer a curtain in both azimuth and elevation and azimuth. They did kind of backdoor steering. They put a delay line on one of the curtains, and they could steer the azimuth on it a little bit. Could not do the elevation. But later on, you could steer a curtain both ways. China took the easy way out. They just rotated. I mean, they built this gigantic structure to rotate a curtain. It's absolutely amazing.
I had heard that the Russians had a way of raising and lowering their rhombics to determine the vertical angle of radiation.
They could have. I don't know about that. Yeah, which is what would be required. When the rhombics were set at 150 feet, and when they had to get rid of the wood poles, put in metal towers, they went up to 170 feet, specifically to get a little better angle on that. But that's the only control they had. Good question. Yeah.
I would say your program was very fascinating, well done, and
Thank you.
I really enjoyed it.
It's a fun subject. Thank you, and it's a fun place to be involved in, particularly for a ham. I mean, I was licensed at age 12, and I never would have imagined that I would ever be playing with this kind of stuff, but it's just fun playing.
We got a ham operator right there, his license when he was about 11 or 12, I think, weren't you?
Yeah, it's been a long time, yeah. Okay, well, thank you again very much.
Thank you.
And
Thanks for coming.
you're welcome down at the museum anytime.
Will you be down there when we go for a tour?
Absolutely. Let me know you're coming and I'll make sure I'm the tour guide. Absolutely, yeah. We have both technical and non-technical tour guides. I'm one of the engineers that will do a technical tour. There's a couple others, but probably be better if I was there.